Presidential election time is finally here, and I feel there is no better time to discuss the most important people in the United States federal government. Not presidents, but the people that the presidents delegate all their duties to. While yes, presidents are in fact important, the United States cabinet members are arguably a lot more important, as they are the ones who actually get to do a lot of the important things that the president so desperately wants to do. And yet despite this, we don't really know much about a lot of the members of the United States cabinet outside of maybe the most current one. For past cabinets, we only know one member, and it is the member that is the least useful. So I figured that I would use this time to hopefully give you some good information about some members of the United States cabinet that were actually really good. The only stipulation for this list will be no vice presidents will make it on the list. As I've said before, the vice president is arguably the least useful cabinet position because they only have one job, and it is to be healthy in case the guy in charge dies, not like an actual job as the cabinet members do. Alright, here we go. Number 10, Henry Wallace. The only reason that he is so low is because he inevitably got to be in that vice president's position, so he has to be deducted points just for that. But I didn't really put him here for that position. I put him here for his tenure as Secretary of Agriculture. Basically, his duty was to remind Roosevelt to not only focus on the banking crisis aspects of the Great Depression, but also focus on the farming aspects as well, Wallace playing a vital role in passing the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which basically gave subsidies to farmers to help keep their commodities prices up by taxing the large companies that buy farm products. He even continued when the Supreme Court said that agriculture was purely a local activity, rebutting with, "Were agriculture truly a local matter in 1936, as the Supreme Court says it is, half of the people of the United States would quickly starve." While I'd love to put him higher, sadly, the disease known as vice presidencies make him go down. Number 9, Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General for his brother, and LBJ for a little bit of time. His appointment was actually very controversial, as he had no experience on any court of law, which was weird considering his job is supposed to be the chief lawyer of the United States government. So then what was Bobby's job? Well, simply put, his job was basically becoming the second vice president, and arguably one that had a lot more power in the administration. A fact that was not lost on anybody, especially LBJ, who held immense animosity towards Bobby. Essentially every major thing that happened during Kennedy's years as president, Bobby was right there, whispering in his ear, playing a vital role in easing the tensions of the Berlin crisis of 1961, as well as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Doing exactly what a brother should be doing, getting one of them out of a fight that they clearly started. I put him low for a couple of reasons. One, under a vague technicality, he can kind of be considered a vice president. Two, the obvious nepotism that was putting him in this position. And 3, some of the bad things he did, such as authorizing the wiretapping of Martin Luther King Jr. Number 8, W. Willard Wirtz, Secretary of Labor under Kennedy and LBJ. Wirtz had been commonly called the champion of the unemployed. He pushed extensively to help people get employed and other opportunities, which worked really well as unemployment dropped a lot under his tenure. And he pushed so that when they got jobs, it was fair and pushing for non-discriminatory practices, such as closing the wage gap. He was originally very close to LBJ, but after he gave a tepid critique of Vietnam, the goodwill disappeared. Wirtz is pretty good all things considered, but there was one really weird thing that he did during the administration that is really interesting of note. During his administration, he faced 2 labor shortages, one being a shortage of migrant workers, and one being a shortage in summer jobs for teenagers. His solution would be sending teenagers to the fields. Unsurprisingly, it fell, much like his spot on the list. Number 7, George Romney, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under Richard Nixon. There was a very interesting divide between the two. It was made pretty clear from day one that Romney only had that job to prevent liberal Republicans from primarying Nixon. As such, Romney basically did whatever he wanted without telling Tricky Dick. What he chose to do was enact an ambitious housing plan that would do away with the housing discrimination, particularly in regards to African Americans, creating an open housing program called Open Communities to facilitate desegregating housing. Another plan he made was Operation Breakthrough, which sought to make housing more available to lower income individuals. However, while Romney's plans were ambitious, not a lot of people were on board, most particularly the people in Romney's home state who were supposed to test the plan, and good old Tricky Dick, who essentially pulled the plug at the slightest pushback. The second half of his term was basically staving off Nixon not so subtly telling Romney to leave, which he ended up doing after the term was done. While ambitious, and he clearly wanted to do a good job, Romney just did not have the time or administration to actually fulfill his plans. Number 6. William Jennings Bryan, Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. Bryan did not last long in this job, and this job was mostly Woodrow Wilson saying, "Thanks for the support, now here's your prize." Bryan was actually a very interesting choice for the job due to the fact that he was an ardent non-interventionist, a huge contrast to the imperialist foreign policies of the last two administrations. As such, Bryan mostly stayed away from foreign affairs, the thing that he was actually set there to do, and actually tried to influence Wilson's domestic policies, such as helping institute the progressive income tax and even pressuring Wilson to have it so that bankers can't appoint people to the newly made Federal Reserve Board. Not to say that Bryan didn't do anything in regards to foreign policy, but he mostly took a diplomatic route, like negotiating treaties with 30 countries that would lead to peaceful solutions to their disputes, and trying to broker a conference to end World War I. Like I said, however, Bryan's tenure was short, as Wilson and him had different perspectives on the European war that was going on at the time. So Bryan would inevitably resign from the position, as he knew he wasn't getting through to Wilson. Man, if only he actually listened to Bryan. Number 5. George Marshall. Marshall was the Secretary of State for Harry Truman. Marshall was a very interesting choice, as he seemed to be one of the most apolitical people to serve in politics, as he felt his duty as a soldier was to not fall prey to partisanship of any variety. Given his duty as Secretary of State, he mostly focused on foreign policy post-World War II, and as the name suggests, he was basically the architect and spokesman for the Marshall Plan, the massive plan to help rebuild Europe after the massive war we just fought, which was an overall good thing, albeit with some flaws that we may get into. But back to the praise of Marshall, his anti-partisanship had even led to him butting heads with Truman, his most controversial take being that he was against the recognition of the State of Israel, seeing Truman only supporting it to get the Jewish vote in the upcoming election, and telling Truman point blank, "Mr. President, if you take this action, and if I were to vote in this election, I would vote against you." The one controversial aspect of the Marshall Plan was that it was kind of seen as a sort of Red Scare-esque type thing, like the US trying to exert their own geopolitical influence in the region to prevent communism. But that wasn't necessarily Marshall's intentions. His intentions was purely to help rebuild Europe after World War II, even wanting to help communist nations, with people like Truman being the one to help muddy the waters. Number 4. Harold L. Eakes, Secretary of the Interior under FDR and Harry Truman. Eakes was also the leader of the Public Works Administration, where he took charge of the massive public works programs that helped the United States during the Great Depression. Although don't let that imply that he was just a follower of FDR and nothing more, as they frequently pushed against each other, usually because Eakes had more foresight. Some examples include not wanting to give the Palmyra Atoll to the Navy to use as a base because that would mean destroying a scientific and scenic masterpiece, preventing the sale of helium to Germany because he theorized that they would eventually be used for military purposes, and even helped push for a plan where he would help give Jewish refugees of Nazi Germany Alaska as their homeland. Imagine what the world would have been like if that were to happen as opposed to what ended up happening. Also pushing extensively to help efforts to end segregation, appointing the first African American cabinet member, and having a group of advisors on race relations called the Black Kitchen Cabinet. Speaking of, number 3, Robert C. Weaver, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under LBJ. Weaver was also that first black cabinet member that was appointed by Eakes. Weaver was actually instrumental in the creation of the cabinet position that he would head. Funnily enough, Weaver was actually considered too radical for the position at first, as he seemed to be open to the idea of a housing guarantee, but LBJ couldn't find anybody else better for the job, so Weaver got it. Weaver was commonly quoted as saying, "You cannot have physical renewal without human renewal," pushing really hard to get close to that, from improving the houses that would be used for public housing by offering incentives to keep them up to date, increasing the amount of money given to small businesses displaced by urban renewal, and revive the program of rent subsidies to the elderly. Having a lot of big ambitions, unfortunately not being able to go far enough. But that's kind of the tale of a lot of people that get into government. Number 2, Robert Reich. Yes, before this guy became a Twitter savant, I guess, he was the Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton. Wait, don't leave! If you've seen his Twitter things, you know he's pretty good, so hear me out. This 411 progressive had his work cut out for him. The 90s was changing the economy very drastically, and Reich's job was to make sure that workers would not be left behind under this new economy. He used his duty to try and spread an extremely pro-worker message in an administration that was not necessarily the best for them. In a philosophical sense, Reich popularized the term corporate welfare and tried to push for training workers in technological skills. In regards to policies, Reich pushed for increasing the minimum wage and pushed for the passage of the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993, which guaranteed 12 work weeks off after a medical emergency or the birth of a new kid. While Reich only stayed during the first term, as stated before, he remained relevant heavily afterwards, which is what at least shaped my perspective on him philosophically. I did actually have him as number 1 on this list for a while. That was until I found out about number 1, Frances Perkins, Secretary of Labor under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the first woman to be a member of the U.S. Cabinet. Perkins was very important to the administration, and by that I mean, without her, the New Deal would not have been as good as it was. As we all know, FDR was a president for a very long time, and as such, he was okay with shifting the cabinet around every so often. But not Perkins. Perkins remained seated in that position for all 12 years of his administration, which served as a little bit of a shock to herself, because she actually thought that the radical direction that she was going to go would make it so that she was one of the first members of the cabinet to leave, telling FDR, "Nothing like this has ever been done in the United States before. You know that, don't you?" But of course, that is exactly what we needed. We call FDR the best president because of the New Deal, but Perkins deserves all of the credit. And if you need any further proof that she is the best cabinet member, just like Wallace, the second Truman walked in, she was out. That's all the proof I need. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to our website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.